You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
I sometimes like to joke that I live in a world of death, and I don't mean that in a morbid or depressing way, but rather because nearly every story I've written for this podcast over the past 17 years involves the passing of individuals. Which of course means that I'm constantly scouring the records of ancestry, my heritage, Find a Grave, the obituaries, and so many other similar resources. So I'm going to tell you in advance that the man who is central to today's story is going to die. But it's definitely not a sad story. You see, he was fully aware of his impending fate, and it concerned him little as to whether he'd live for a few more days, weeks, or even months. What truly mattered was his final wish, and that was to improve the lives of those in his community. And to do so, he was determined to give away every single penny of the fortune that he had amassed over his lifetime. But what made his generosity truly remarkable was his steadfast refusal of any recognition at all. He simply wished to die in complete anonymity, preferring not to be remembered for his actions. And I have to tell you, it appears that he achieved his goal. And that's because here we are nearly 75 years after his passing, and the impact of his most significant contribution continues to benefit thousands of people daily. Yet, I have to tell you, I doubt that any of them would know who he was. Coming up next is the story of a generous man who went by the name of Mr. Benefactor. I am Steve Silverman, and this is the Useless Information Podcast.
Useless information.
It's November of 1949, and the 39,000 residents of the city of Aurora, Illinois had a strange mystery before them. It seems that some anonymous individual in just a matter of days had been handing out sizable donations all over town. Now, the press never did provide a complete accounting of who received what, but I was able to piece together a list of all the donations that were mentioned in the various news articles. As I read through these, I'm not going to adjust each one for inflation. I'll do that on the grand total at the end. But just to give you a rough estimate, the approximate multiplier to determine these donations in 2024 dollars is 13. So if I say $100, that would be about $1,300 today, 1,000 is 13,000, and so on. Anyway, here we go. An estimated 100 individuals from all walks of life were given checks ranging in value from $100 and up. This included 7 children, all under the age of 13, who were provided with $1,000 checks to further their education. Then there were 2 couples who received an undisclosed amount of cash to purchase homes with. There was an elderly woman who supported both her daughter and granddaughter, and she received a check, as did parents with large families and college students in need of assistance. There was a donation of $5,000 made to both the Mercyville Sanitarium and the Jack and Jill Nursery. The Sunnymere Old People's Home received $6,000. Mercy and St. Joseph's Hospital both were given $6,000 in cash plus $10,000 in bonds. Trinity Episcopal Church received $15,000. And then Aurora Mayor Lloyd H. Markle was handed a check for $25,000, and that was so the city could build a new auditorium. But the grand prize was $50,000. It was given to East Aurora School Superintendent K.D. Waldo to either build a new high school, add on to the existing structure, or to purchase equipment for either of those 2 options. In total, the anonymous donor gave away $350,000 in a matter of weeks. Adjusted for inflation, that works out to approximately $4.6 million today. Wow. But just who was this mysterious man? Inquiring minds want to know. One man who did know the man's identity was investment broker John K. Hucko, who, along with the Chicago Trust Company, had been named to administer the funds. It was Hucko who had been going around town and handing out the bulk of those checks. According to an article in the February 26, 1950 publication of the American Weekly magazine, the anonymous donor who wished to only be known as Mr. Benefactor walked into Hucko's office and said,
I want to give my money away while I'm still alive to see people get pleasure from it. I want to do something for the city my family loved. It's been good to us, and so have a lot of folks. I don't want any thanks or attention. That's why you're going to give it away from me. Now here's my list.
Now, before I continue on with the story, I should point out that American Weekly was known for embellishing stories, so it's doubtful that those exact words were ever said. But a similar conversation certainly did take place, and there's absolutely no question that Mr. Benefactor asked Hucko to give away all his money for him. In truth, many of the recipients of the anonymous donor's gifts were aware of his identity. However, they had all solemnly pledged to keep his identity a secret, and true to their word, they were keeping their traps shut. Kind of hard to believe, huh? But someone must have spilled the beans. That's because on Tuesday, November 8th of 1949, Mr. Benefactor found himself on the receiving end of a phone call from a Chicago Tribune reporter seeking clarification. It turns out that this elderly gentleman had been residing in a room at Aurora's Leland Hotel, which at the time was the tallest building in Illinois outside of Chicago, and today is known as Leland Tower. One thing that was immediately clear was that this generous man was gravely ill. He spoke with a weak, raspy voice, and he adamantly avoided any discussion about the specifics of his condition. While it was established that he was terminally ill, he would not discuss how much longer he had to live. Anyway, this self-appointed Santa Claus agreed to share his story, but that was only after he secured a pledge from the reporter that his identity would remain undisclosed.
I am requesting that my name not be made public because I do not want it to appear that I am doing what I am doing to obtain publicity or glory. My only purpose is to make happy while I'm still alive those dear friends who have been thoughtful of me and my late wife and sisters.
The newspaper man did keep his word, but by the time the story went to press the next day, everyone would know Mr. Benefactor's name. That's because after the interview was over, he mentioned to his close friend Superintendent Waldo that
it's out now.
He only meant that his attempt to avoid publicity was over, but Waldo interpreted that to mean that the man's identity was no longer a secret. And after that, the whole world knew who the man was. He was 74-year-old James Powell Jr., a retired insurance broker and real estate man. Born in Aurora on March 31st, 1875, he was the youngest of 5 children. In birth order, they were George, Ella, Grace, Mina, and finally James Jr. What I found interesting was that none of his 3 sisters would ever marry. After graduating from East Aurora High School in 1894, he joined his father's real estate firm, James Powell and Son. Although technically with his older brother George also involved, it should have been named James Powell and Sons, but let's not get picky here. In 1903, he teamed up with Joseph Reed to establish Powell and Reed, and that was a firm that specialized in real estate loans and insurance. And he continued in this profession until his retirement. Needless to say, James Powell Jr. amassed considerable wealth in the process. On April 18, 1911, when he was 36 years old, Powell married 32-year-old Helen Morgan, and the two had a very happy marriage, but did not have any children. Sadly, as they grew older, each and every member of their families would pass on. In fact, all the James siblings died in the exact order of their birth, but luckily the two had one another. But that would all change on June 1st of 1949. That's when 70-year-old Helen passed away in St. Joseph's Hospital, and their 38-year love affair had sadly come to an end. Being in failing health himself, James decided that it was in his best interest to relocate to the Leland Hotel. That's how he ended up there. And my guess is he did this because the hotel staff there would be able to care for him as he lived out his final days in semi-seclusion. It was while he was there that he thought back to all the joy that Christmas giving had brought to both Helen and him. But the problem was he had no close relatives remaining, so he just decided to give his entire fortune away. Well, I should point out it's not exactly his entire fortune. he did hold on to a trust fund, the proceeds of which would cover his care for the remainder of his life. I should also mention that Powell was certain that his wife would have approved of this plan if she had still been alive. Naturally, as news of his generosity spread through newspapers nationwide, everyone clamored for a piece of the pie. But they apparently missed or chose to ignore the portion of the story where Powell mentioned that he had dispensed of the last of his fortune. There was no more money to give. Needless to say, a flood of telegrams, phone calls, and letters requesting money just poured in. There were 6 women who proposed marriage, and then there were others who requested funds to pay for everything ranging from dentures to wooden legs. And on top of all that, reporters and photographers showed up at the hotel requesting to see him. But he was a really sick man. Powell's only option was to have the telephone disconnected and to hide out in his room. On November 24th, 1949, as the citizens of Aurora awoke to begin their final preparations for the Thanksgiving feast, they received the somber news that James Powell had quietly passed away in his hotel room shortly after midnight. This was just 16 days after he had completed giving away his fortune. And just as in life, Powell requested that his funeral be a quiet affair. A brief private ceremony was held, and then he was lowered into the ground in the West Big Rock Cemetery, right next to where his wife Helen had been buried 6 months earlier. James Powell may have been gone, but his generosity did not cease in death. In April 1950, attorney David B. Givler, the executor of his estate, he announced that the trust fund that Powell had left was much larger than originally thought. That's mainly because Powell had invested much of it in stocks for a newfangled invention. Are you ready for it? It was called television. Maybe you've heard of it. Anyway, as a result, his estate had grown to $147,618. That's about $1.92 million today. His will specified that 3 of his distant relatives would receive $25,000 each. But a codicil to that document invalidated those bequests. Now, it's not that he was being stingy, it's because Powell had already given them the money. What that meant was that the entire amount now went to the remaining beneficiary that was named. That just happened to be the East Aurora High School, the same school he had already given $50,000 to. So you're probably wondering, what did the school do with the money? Well, they threw a really big party. Okay, not really. In the school's 1950 yearbook, high school principal John Gates wrote,
"The most recent project undertaken by the board with the aid of a PTA is that of a building program, possibly including a new high school. Although there have been discussions concerning a new high school or addition, the plans are still in the nebulous stage. The building has been brought into focus during the past year by the gift of James Powell in the amount of $50,000, plus the rest of $147,618 estate, less taxes."
And it's those darn taxes that really chipped away at that amount. By the time Powell's estate was completely settled 3 years later, taxes and fees reduced the balance to $78,671. That's about $924,000 today. Anyway, by this time, Gates had been promoted to superintendent and told the press that this sum, coupled with that original $50,000 donation, would be used to help pay for a brand new high school. And that school was estimated to cost around $4 million. And they did build it. That new school would open in September 1957, and it's still in use today. Although I should note that the number of buildings on the campus has increased. In his honor, the new school library was named the James Powell Library, although I can't help but wonder if the name is still in use today. Sometimes those things just get lost to history. And if his name is forgotten, that probably would have been fine with James Powell, a man who wished to pass on his fortune in anonymity. But at the very least, Powell lived long enough to witness the fulfillment of his wish. That was to see others benefit from his fortune. And today the students of East Aurora High School are still benefiting from one man's incredible generosity. That's even if they have no clue who he was. Useless, useful, I'll leave that for you to decide. I first researched a story on James Powell back in February of 2014, but for some reason I never went any further with it. Of course, the advantage of waiting 10 years is that now there's a lot more information available online, and I was able to hunt down more information, to add to what I had already collected. I should mention that the only detail I left out was that Powell supposedly left $500. That's about $6,500 today. He left $500 to either 2 or to 4 of his bellboys at the Leland Hotel. Since I had conflicting information and that detail really didn't add to the story, I just decided it was best to leave it out. Just a reminder that you can find the Useless Information podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're listening to me right now through one of the many apps that are out there, be sure to hit the subscribe button. You can also follow the podcast on both Facebook and X, plus you can contact me via email at steve@uselessinformation.org, or you can use the contact form on my website, which is also uselessinformation.org. The Useless Information Podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network, so be sure to visit airwavemedia.com, and there you'll find a curated selection of some of the best podcasts out there. Anyway, thanks for listening, and take care, everyone. Bye.